What caused the Mexican War?
The Two-Year War, 1846–48, was fought over the United States annexation of Texas. The events that led up to the conflict began in 1837 when President Andrew Jackson 1767–1845, recognized Texas as independent. This was just after Texas had won its war with Mexico. Republic of Texas President Sam Houston, 1793–1863, felt that protection against a Mexican invasion may be necessary, so he eyed annexation to the United States. In the meantime, Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna, 1794–1876, warned that such an action on the part of the United States would be equivalent to a declaration of war against the Mexican Republic. In June 1844, the U.S. Senate rejected a proposed annexation treaty. But later that year, Democratic Party nominee James K. Polk, 1795–1849, an ardent expansionist, was elected president. Because the annexation of Texas had figured prominently in his campaign platform, outgoing President John Tyler, 1790–1862, viewed Polk's victory as a public mandate for annexation, and he recommended that Congress pass a joint resolution to invite Texas into the Union. Congress did so in February, and President Tyler signed the resolution on March 1, 1845. 3 days before leaving office, Mexico responded by breaking off diplomatic relations with the United States. A border dispute made the situation increasingly tenuous. Texas claimed that its southern border was the Rio Grande River, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, situated farther north. In June, President Polk ordered Brigadier General Zachary Taylor, 1784–1850, to move his forces into the disputed area. In November, the U.S. government received word that Mexico was prepared to talk. Polk dispatched Congressman John Slidell, 1793–1871, to Mexico to discuss 3 other outstanding issues: the purchase of California, for $25 million, the purchase of New Mexico, for $5 million, and the payment of damages to American nationals for losses incurred in Mexican revolutions. This last point was critical to the negotiations, as Polk was prepared to have the United States assume payment of damages to its own citizens in exchange for Mexico's recognition of the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. But upon arrival in Mexico City, Slidell was refused the meeting. President José Joaquín Herrera, 1792–1854, had bowed to pressure, opposing discussions with the United States. When Polk received news of the scuttled talks, he authorized General Taylor to advance through the disputed territory to the Rio Grande. Meanwhile, Mexico overthrew President Herrera, putting into office the fervent nationalist General Mariano Paredes y Arrillaga, 1797–1849, who reaffirmed Mexico's claim to Texas and pledged to defend Mexican territory. While Polk worked through Slidell to get an audience with the Mexican government, the attempts failed. And on May 9 the cabinet met and approved the president's recommendation to ask Congress to declare war. The next day news arrived in Washington that on April 25 a sizable Mexican force had crossed the Rio Grande and surrounded a smaller American reconnaissance party. 11 Americans were killed and the rest were wounded or captured. On May 11 Polk delivered a message to Congress, concluding, "Mexico has shed American blood upon the American soil. War exists, by the act of Mexico herself." By the time the war was officially declared, on May 13, just more than 1 year after Polk had been sworn into office, General Taylor had already fought and won key battles against the Mexicans and had occupied the northern Mexico city of Matamoros.
What caused the Spanish-American War?
The 1898 War, which lasted only a matter of months. Late April to mid-August, was fought over the liberation of Cuba. During the 1870s the Cuban people rebelled against Spanish rule. But once that long rebellion had been put down, peace on the Caribbean island did not hold. Worsening economic conditions prompted revolution in 1895. American leaders, the bloody American Civil War. 1861–65, still in their memories, feared that while the Cuban rebels could not win their battle against the Spanish, neither were the Spanish strong enough to fully put down the insurrection. Meanwhile, the American public, fed by a steady stream of newspaper accounts reporting oppressive conditions on the island, increasingly supported U.S. intervention in the Cuban conflict. In November 1897 President William McKinley, 1843–1901, did intervene. But it was through political, rather than military, pressure. As a result, Spain granted Cuba limited self-government within the Spanish Empire. However, the move did not satisfy the Cuban rebels, who were determined to achieve independence from Spain. The fighting continued. Rioting broke out in Havana, and in order to protect Americans living there, the United States sent the battleship Maine to the port on January 25, 1898. On February 15, an explosion blew up the Maine, killing more than 200 people. Blame for the blast was promptly, and history would later conclude, wrongly assigned to Spain. While President McKinley again made several attempts to pressure Spain into granting Cuba full independence, it was to no avail. Nevertheless, on April 19, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution recognizing an independent Cuba, disclaiming American intention to acquire the island, and authorizing the use of the American Army and Navy to force Spanish withdrawal. On April 25, the United States formally declared that the country was at war with Spain. In the months that followed, American forces battled the Spanish and Spanish loyalists in Cuba and the Spanish-controlled Philippines. There was also military activity on Puerto Rico. However, the American forces there met little resistance. Once Santiago, Cuba, was surrendered by the Spanish after the battle at San Juan Hill in July 1898, it would only be a matter of weeks before a ceasefire was called and an armistice was signed, on August 12, ending the brief war.
What happened to the Tacoma-Narrows Bridge?
In 1940, the new 2,800-foot suspension bridge, carrying traffic across Washington's Puget Sound, was hit by high winds, causing it to buckle and undulate. In the simplest of terms, an engineering error allowed one of the suspensions to give way in the wind, and the bridge became ribbon-like, moving in waves. It was 10 years before a second span was opened over the body of water. The 1940 accident prompted engineers and bridge designers to be more cautious in the design of suspension bridges. The first wire suspension bridge in the U.S. was built in 1842, the 358-foot long and 25-foot wide bridge spanned the Schuylkill River, near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was supported by 5 wire cables on either side, and was built by U.S. civil engineer Charles Ellett, Jr. 1810 to 1862, the first chain suspension bridge in the U.S. was built in 1800.
How long have hurricanes been given names?
The practice of naming hurricanes has a long history. According to the National Hurricane Center, for hundreds of years Caribbean storms were named according to the saint whose liturgical day it was when the storm hit. This became confusing when hurricanes struck on the same day but in different years, leading to such references as Hurricane San Felipe II. During World War II, the U.S. military began naming storms, giving them women's names. In 1951 the American Weather Services began naming Atlantic Ocean storms according to a phonetic alphabet: Abel, Baker, Charlie, etc. Just a few years later forecasters returned to using women's names, and a new list of names was created for each Atlantic hurricane season, June 1 to November 30. Storms in some areas of the Pacific began being named in 1959, and by 1964, all regions of the Pacific were using the naming convention. For each year, there is a list for each region of the world where tropical cyclones occur: Atlantic, Eastern North Pacific, Central North Pacific, Western North Pacific, etc. The lists of names are agreed upon at international meetings of the World Meteorological Association. Establishing names for storms helps meteorologists track more than one storm at any given time, makes clear the communication of warnings, and facilitates study since the names of major hurricanes are retired to avoid confusion later. In 1979 equality was brought to the naming process, introducing men's names as well as multicultural names to each season's list. since each season's storms are named in alphabetical order. There is a preponderance of storms beginning with the letters A, B, and C. However, in 1995, Hurricane Opal ravaged the Florida Panhandle. Not since forecasters began naming hurricanes had they reached the letter O. The letters Q, U, X, Y, and Z are not used because there are so few names beginning with those letters.
How did World War I end?
Though the United States had been little prepared to enter the war, the American government mobilized quickly to rally the troops and the citizens behind the war effort. In April 1917, the U.S. regular army was comprised of just more than 100,000 men. By the end of the war, the American armed forces stood some 5 million strong. It was the arrival of the U.S. troops that gave the Allies the manpower they needed to win the war. After continued fighting in the trenches of Europe, which had left almost 10 million dead, in November 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice and the Central Powers finally surrendered. In January 1919, Allied representatives gathered in Paris to draw up the peace settlement.
Why was the completion of the Erie Canal important to you? S. Development.
Completed in 1825, the Erie Canal joined the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, linking the east with the west and for the first time allowing freight and settlers to easily move back and forth between the regions. Begun on July 4, 1817, the canal was sponsored by Governor DeWitt Clinton. 1769 to 1828, of New York, who planned and eventually carried out the huge building project. The waterway was funded by the state of New York, which paid just over $7 million to complete it. The original canal was 363 miles long, 40 feet wide at the surface, and 4 feet deep. It had 83 locks, which raised vessels 562 feet between the Hudson River and Lake Erie. A lock is a section of a canal that can be closed to control the water level, and is then used to either raise or lower a vessel to another body of water. Beginning at Albany, New York, on the Hudson River, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean at New York City. The canal extends west as far as Buffalo, New York, on Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes. The waterway, which was inaugurated by the run of the barge Seneca Chief on October 26, 1825, could transport passengers aboard boats and move cargo aboard barges, which were pulled by teams of horses and mules on the ground. In spite of the critics, who dubbed the ambitious project Clinton's Wonder and Clinton's Ditch, the canal's positive impact on the American economy was felt within the first decade of its operation. The new transportation route reduced freight rates both eastward and westward, made Buffalo a major port in the region and New York City a major international port, was a catalyst for population growth. In upstate New York and throughout the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, and prompted other states, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, to build canals, further opening up the country's interior to development and commerce. Since crops could be shipped from these lush farmlands and as more farms came into existence, the Erie Canal helped supply the newly arrived immigrants in the eastern cities with food. In turn, they shipped manufactured goods west to the farming communities. The canal was enlarged several times between 1835 and 1862 to increase its capacity. In 1903, New York voted to link the canal with 3 shorter waterways in the state to form the New York State Barge Canal, which opened in 1918.
What was the Peloponnesian War?
It was the war fought between the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta between 431 and 404 B. C. It left Athens ruined. The beginning of the war signaled the end of the Golden Age of Greece, as the city-states, which were self-ruling regions made up of a city and the surrounding territory, developed, an intense rivalry grew between Athens and Sparta. The Spartans recruited allies into the Peloponnesian League. The Peloponnese Peninsula forms the southern part of mainland Greece, and together they attacked the Athenian Empire, which had been gaining in power. The war consisted of 3 stages. The first was the Archidamian War, 431 to 421 BC. Named for Archidamus, the Spartan king who led the unsuccessful attacks on fortified Athens. In 421, the so-called Peace of Nicias, 421 to 413 BC, began, which was negotiated by Athenian politician Nicias. But this truce was broken when an Athenian commander promoted counterattacks on Athens's aggressors in 418 and 415 BC. The attacks on the Peloponnesian League were unsuccessful, and so the Ionian War broke out, 413 to 404 BC. After years of fighting, the Ionian War finally ended in victory for Sparta, after the Peloponnesian League had not only gained the support of Persia to defeat Athens but had successfully encouraged Athens' own subjects to revolt. Athens surrendered to Sparta, ending the Peloponnesian War.
Why are Pavlov's dogs well known?
Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, 1849 to 1936, carried out famous experiments with dogs, which were intended to demonstrate conditioned reflex. Noticing that the laboratory dogs would sometimes salivate merely at the approach of the lab assistants who fed them, Pavlov, who was already a Nobel laureate for his research on digestion, set out to determine whether he could turn normally unconditioned reflexes or responses of the central nervous system into conditioned reflexes. He demonstrated that if a bell is rung every time a dog is fed, eventually the dog becomes conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell, even if there is no food present. In this way, Pavlov substituted artificial stimulus, the ringing of the bell, for natural or environmental stimulus, food, to prompt a physiological reaction, salivation. Based on these experiments, Pavlov concluded that all acquired habits depend on chains of conditioned reflexes. This conclusion contributed to the development of behaviorism.
Which U.S. state was the first to abolish slavery?
Vermont was first, in 1777. On July 8 of that year Vermont adopted a state constitution that prohibited slavery. The first document in the United States to outlaw slavery, it read in part, "No male person born in this country, or brought from oversea, ought to be holden by law, to serve any person, as a servant, slave or apprentice, after he arrives to the age of 21 years, nor female, in like manner, after she arrives to the age of 18 years, unless they are bound by their own consent. After they arrive to such age, or bound by law, for the payment of debts, damages, fines, costs, or the like." Vermont's constitution also gave suffrage to all men, regardless of race. Vermonters were the first to put a black legislator in the state house, Alexander Twilight. 1795 to 1857, was elected as a representative in 1836. Twilight also earned another first. In 1823 he graduated from Vermont's Middlebury College to become the first black person in the nation to earn a college degree.
What was drive? Mudd tried for?
A doctor who treated the broken ankle of John Wilkes Booth, 1838 to 1865, after Booth shot President Abraham Lincoln. On April 14, 1865, he died the next day. Samuel Mudd was later charged as an accomplice in the president's assassination and was charged with treason and conspiracy. He was tried before a military commission and on June 30, 1865, was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. 3 years later Mudd was pardoned by President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875. The official reason for the pardon was Mudd's humanitarian efforts to save lives during a prison epidemic. But the case against him had been flimsy at best, and history has credited the guilty verdict to overly ambitious politics and a commission bent on retribution. Nevertheless, Mudd's name remained tainted, giving the popular culture the phrase, "His name is Mudd."
When was Hollywood's golden age?
Hollywood had its heyday in the 1930s, in the same decade that the Great Depression crippled the world economy. The American film industry enjoyed its golden age. The era was marked by technical innovations. Talking movies had made their debut in 1927 with the first full-length film with sound, The Jazz Singer, and by 1932 all films were talkies. The first Technicolor film, Becky Sharp, debuted in 1935, and by 1939 was perfected when Gone with the Wind was released. And special effects were brought to the screen in 1933 with King Kong, which was the result of painstaking stop-motion and rear projection photography. In the meantime, movie stars such as Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert, Greta Garbo, and the Marx Brothers achieved public followings that were the envy of political and business leaders. The MGM, Warner Brothers, and RKO Studios led Hollywood production, but other studios, including Fox, Paramount, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, also fared well during these difficult times. In 1939 Hollywood had what has often been called its greatest year. Among the top releases that year were the classics Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Ninotchka, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Gunga Din. By the end of the decade Hollywood had become a major contributor to popular culture, an occasional contributor to high culture, and a dynamic, if unsteady, force in the nation's economy.
What advances were made in medicine during the Middle Ages?
During the Middle Ages, 500-1350, medicine became institutionalized. The first public hospitals were opened and the first formal medical schools were established, making healthcare, formerly administered only in the home, more widely available and improving the training of doctors. These developments had been brought on by necessity. Europe saw successive waves of epidemics during the Middle Ages. Outbreaks of leprosy began in the 500s and peaked in the 1200s, the Black Death. The bubonic plague killed about a quarter of the European population. And smallpox and other diseases afflicted hundreds of thousands of people. Consequently, many hospitals meant to serve the poor were established, as were the first medical schools, some of them associated with universities that were then forming, such as the University of Bologna, Italy, and the University of Paris, France. In 900 the first medical school was started in Salerno, Italy. European physicians during the period were greatly influenced by the works of Persian physician and philosopher Rhazes, or Reza, c. 865 c. 930. Considered the greatest doctor of the Islamic world. Rhazes's works accurately describing measles and smallpox were translated into Latin and became seminal references in the Christian world as well. Another prominent Islamic, the scientist Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, 980-1037, produced a philosophical scientific encyclopedia, which included the medical knowledge of the time. In the West, the work became known as Canon of Medicine, and with its descriptions of many diseases, including tetanus and meningitis, it remained influential in European medical education for the next 600 years.
When was slavery outlawed in Europe?
The slave trade ended in Britain in 1807, when authorities agreed with the growing number of abolitionists. Those who argued that slavery is immoral and violates Christian beliefs, and outlawed the trade. In 1833 slavery was abolished throughout the British colonies as the culmination of the great anti-slavery movement in Great Britain. In the United States, the slave trade was prohibited in 1808, but possessing slaves was still legal. Consequently, trade on the black market continued until Britain stepped up its enforcement of its anti-slavery law by conducting naval blockades and surprise raids off the African coast, effectively closing the trade. The slave trade as it had been known officially came to an end after 1870, when it was outlawed throughout the Americas. Throughout the world, the United Nations works to abolish slavery and other systems of forced labor.
Why was the invention of barbed wire important to Western development?
Barbed wire was commercially developed in 1874 by American inventor Joseph Glidden, 1813 to 1906. Consisting of steel wires that are twisted together to make sharp points resembling thorns. The material was quickly implemented in the West to construct fences. With trees scarce on the Great Plains, farmers had lacked the materials to erect wooden fences. Instead they resorted to planting prickly shrubs as a way of defining their lands and confining livestock. However, this method was not always effective. With the advent of barbed wire, farmers were able to fence in their acreage. Cattle owners became angered by small farmers who put up barbed wire. They had previously allowed livestock to roam the open plain. Fearing depletion of grazing lands, ranchers also began using barbed wire to fence tracts. Whether or not they could claim legal title to them. Disputes arose between ranchers and farmers. In 1885 President Grover Cleveland, 1837 to 1908, brought an end to illegal fencing, ordering officials to remove barbed wire from public lands and Indian reservations. Legal use of the material to define land claim boundaries brought the demise of the open range and helped speed agricultural development of the prairie.
Who were Leopold and Loeb?
Nathan Babe Leopold, 1904 to 1971, and Richard Dickey Loeb, 1905 to 1936, were privileged, well-educated, even brilliant young men who committed what they believed to be the perfect murder. Both were from well-to-do Chicago families. In May 1924 Loeb, then 18 years old, became the youngest graduate of the University of Michigan. He was to go on to postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago. 19-year-old Leopold was a member of Phi Beta Kappa and a law student there. The two became friends, and, as testimony would later reveal, in the fall of 1923 became convinced that they could literally get away with murder, that they could plan it, carry it out, and never get caught. On May 21, 1924, the pair carried out their dastardly plan. Their victim was 14-year-old Bobby Franks, son of a millionaire and cousin to Loeb. Franks's body was found, as were a pair of eyeglasses belonging to Leopold. The spectacles were traced to him, and he and Loeb, who was part of Leopold's alibi, were grilled by the police. They stuck to their story for exactly 1 day. Then Loeb, believing Leopold had betrayed him, confessed. They were charged with murder and kidnapping. Under the counsel of noted defense attorney Clarence Darrow, 1857 to 1938, who had been hired by their families, the pair pled guilty, reducing what would have otherwise been death sentences to life in prison plus 99 years. In 1936 Loeb was killed by a fellow prison inmate. In 1958 Leopold was freed. His sentence had been reduced by Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. In exchange for the inmate's contribution to testing for malaria during World War II, 1939–45. He lived out his life in Puerto Rico, where he married, earned a master's degree, performed charitable works, and taught.
What are WMD?
WMD are weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons that can cause extensive casualties. The term emerged during World War II, 1939–45, the abbreviated WMD became part of everyday language in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the world's superpowers and the United Nations turned their attention to serious threats posed by rogue states and terrorists in a post-Cold War society. Following the launch of the 2003 Iraq War, WMD were regularly in the news. The Bush administration and its chief ally, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, faced sharp public criticism when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. The presence of WMD in that rogue state had been the justification for the controversial invasion. In 2004, President Bush appointed a bipartisan commission to look into why U.S. intelligence agencies had concluded that Iraq possessed WMD. In late March 2005, the commission released to the public an unclassified version of its report. The conclusion: intelligence errors had overstated Iraq's WMD programs. It stated, the daily intelligence briefings, before the Iraq War, were flawed. This was a major intelligence error. The Commission outlined 74 recommendations to improve Intelligence gathering among the United States' 15 spy agencies. The classified version of the report contained information on the intelligence communities. Assessments of the nuclear programs of many of the world's most dangerous actors. It also provided more details on intelligence concerning the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. In Britain, the intelligence failures concerning Iraq spurred a years-long controversy, which damaged Blair's approval ratings and posed tragic consequences. In addition to the loss of life in Iraq, British weapons inspector David Kelly took his own life after publicly accusing the government of overstating the need for war. As in the United States, Britain took steps to tighten controls on its intelligence gathering to prevent errors in judgment. Despite the fact that no WMD were found in Iraq, the White House stood firm on the decision to invade Iraq. On September 11, 2004, the Office of the Press Secretary released a fact sheet titled 3 Years of Progress in the War on Terror. The document stated in part, "We were right to go into Iraq. We removed a declared enemy of America, who had defied the international community for 12 years. And who had the capability of producing weapons of mass murder. And could have passed that capability to the terrorists bent on acquiring them. Although we have not found stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. In the world after September 11, that was a risk we could not afford to take."
How were Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt related?
The two men, among America's most well-known presidents, were distant cousins. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858–1919, was born in New York City, and after a career in public service that included organizing the first volunteer cavalry regiment that was known as the Rough Riders. The ardent outdoors enthusiast became vice president in 1901, when President William McKinley, 1843–1901, died in office later that year. On September 14, Teddy Roosevelt succeeded him as president. He was elected in his own right in 1904 and went on to serve until 1909. Spending nearly 2 full terms in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt was President of the United States when he walked his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884–1962, down the aisle on March 17, 1905. The young woman was marrying her distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882–1945, who had been courting her since he entered college at Harvard in 1900. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born in Hyde Park, New York. Like his fifth cousin Theodore, Franklin went on to a life of public service, which bore some remarkable similarities to that of his cousin. Both Theodore and Franklin served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, 1897–98 and 1913–20, respectively. And both were governors of New York, 1899–1900 and 1929–1933, respectively. As presidents, Both served the nation for more than one term, but Franklin Roosevelt made history for being the only president to be elected for third and fourth terms. In 1951, the U.S. Congress voted in favor of the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidential tenure to just 2 terms. Both served the country in times of conflict. For Theodore it was the Russo-Japanese War. 1904-05, which he was instrumental in ending with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. On September 5, 1905, and for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. Franklin Roosevelt was one of the so-called Big Three leaders, along with Britain's Sir Winston Churchill. 1874 to 1965, and the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953. He coordinated the Allied nations' effort against Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II, 1939 to 45. He, too, was a champion of peace, having been central in laying plans for the United Nations. It's an interesting note, however, that when Teddy Roosevelt ran for president in 1912, he was opposed by his young Democratic cousin Franklin, then a state senator in New York, who supported Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, in the presidential race. After Wilson was elected, he appointed Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a post that delighted him for combining his vocation, politics, with his avocation, ships, and one that certainly furthered his political career. By the end of World War I, 1914-18, Franklin Roosevelt was a well-known national figure. Theodore and Franklin also shared an interest in outdoor activities. But Franklin's participation in sports was curtailed when he was stricken with polio. In August 1921, the 39-year-old Roosevelt was paralyzed for a time. And though he later regained movement and was able to walk with braces, he never fully recovered. Through fierce determination he continued his life of public service, becoming president in 1933. He saw the country through 2 of its most trying periods, the Great Depression, 1929-39, and World War II, 1939-45. He died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage in April 1945.
What was the lasting effect of the Clarence Earl Gideon trials?
A 51-year-old drifter charged with burglary in Panama City, Florida, Clarence Earl Gideon had 2 trials. In 1961 and 1963. But it's what happened between the 2 trials that is important to every American today. What might have been pretty standard fare in the day-to-day business of the American justice system? Gideon was charged with robbing a cigarette machine and a jukebox. The Gideon case instead made history when the defendant successfully argued that his constitutional rights had been denied when he was refused an attorney. Though he had a limited education, after a guilty verdict was handed down in his 1961 trial, Gideon knew enough about his rights to petition the Supreme Court. saying that his right to a fair trial, guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment, had been violated. Since he was not able to hire a lawyer to defend himself, the trial had not been fair. The petition, one of thousands the Supreme Court receives each year, somehow rose to the top. The High Court heard Gideon's case and agreed with his conclusion, calling it an obvious truth, and clearly stating that any person haled into court who is too poor to hire a lawyer, cannot be assured a fair trial unless counsel is provided for him. For Gideon, the opinion served to throw out the first trial, for the rest of America. It was assurance that regardless of the crime, a defendant would be guaranteed legal counsel. With the benefit of that counsel, Gideon's case was retried in 1963. He was acquitted on all charges.
Did the Roman Republic precede the Roman Empire?
Yes, the Roman Republic, which for centuries afterward was considered the model form of a balanced government, was established in 509 B.C. The Roman Empire was not established until 27 BC when Augustus, also known as Octavian, 63 B.C.A.D14, became its first ruler. In brief, the development of ancient Rome is as follows. In 753 BC the city of Rome was established. Legend has it, the city was founded by brothers Romulus and Remus. Situated on wooded hills above the Tiber River, about 15 miles from the sea. Rome enjoyed the advantages of access to trade routes while having natural protection from aggressors. The city was defensible. Agriculture prospered in the area, as did other economic endeavors including manufacturing and mining. In 509 BC the Republic was established by noblemen. The government was headed by two elected officials who were called consuls. Since they shared power, a certain measure of balance was ensured in that either one could veto the actions of the other. And the posts were brief, each elected official served for only 1 year. These heads of state were guided by the Roman Senate, which was made up of senior statesmen. There were also assemblies in which the people had a voice. In 390 BC Rome was captured and sacked by the Gauls, a Celtic people from Western Europe, who were able to hold it for a short time. About 300 BC the Romans came into contact with the Greeks, adopting not only some of their ideas, but their mythology as well. The Greek gods and goddesses were soon given Roman names. By 275 BC Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. Their homeland stable, the Romans set their sights on overseas expansion. And between 264 and 146 BC fought the Punic Wars in order to gain territory. They conquered the Mediterranean islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, part of Gaul, much of Spain, and Carthage, in northern Africa. In the last century BC Rome entered a period that is considered the height of their civilization. But about the middle of that century, the Republic was torn by civil wars. After 20 years of fighting, the Roman Empire was formed in 27 BC when Augustus Octavian became the first emperor. While vestiges of the Republic were maintained, the emperor held supreme authority, nominating the consuls and appointing senators, controlling the provinces, and heading the army. The civilian assemblies were still in place, but had for the most part lost their voice in government. The Roman Empire lasted nearly 500 years. By the 3rd century AD, Roman armies had conquered so many peoples that the empire stretched across Europe and included the entire Mediterranean coast of Africa as well as parts of the Middle East. During this time of power and expansion, trade thrived over a vast network of roads and sea routes, which extended to China, India, and Africa. Coins, made of gold, silver, copper, and bronze, were issued and controlled by the Roman government. In 395, upon the death of Emperor Theodosius the Great, 347 to 395, the Roman Empire was divided into two, East and West. In 476, after suffering a series of attacks from nomadic Germanic tribes, Rome fell.
Was the Chicago fire really started by a cow?
According to legend, the Great Chicago Fire, which burned from October 8 to 9, 1871, was started by a cow. Usually described as belonging to a Mrs. O'Leary, kicking over a kerosene lantern on Decoven Street. But the exact cause is unknown, and many theories exist about how it started from one of the O'Leary's cows, who all perished in the blaze, to speculation that a meteor broke apart, raining fiery particles in the region. The Chicago Historical Society catalogued the damage. The so-called burnt district encompassed an area 4 miles long and an average of 3/4 of a mile wide, more than 2,000 acres including more than 28 miles of streets, 120 miles of sidewalks, and more than 2,000 lamp posts, along with countless trees, shrubs, and flowering plants in the Garden City of the West. Gone were 18,000 buildings and some $200 million in property, about a third of the valuation of the entire city. Around half of this was insured. But the failure of numerous companies cut the actual payments in half again. 100,000 Chicagoans lost their homes, an uncounted number their places of work. Chicago resident Julia Newberry described the aftermath in her diary in an entry dated October 17, published in 1933 by W. W. Norton. The fire began at 12th Street on Sunday night, October. It swept the two magnificent avenues, and every building on the south side from 12th Street to the river. The courthouse, with the original copy of Father's will and no one knows how many invaluable papers, legal documents, records, the beautiful Crosby Opera House, a perfect bijou, of a theater, all the banks, insurance offices, railway depots, churches, and block after block of stores, unequaled anywhere. And then oh misery, the fire, the red, angry, unrelenting fire. Leapt across the Chicago River, and burnt, till Mr. Malin Ogden's house was the only one left standing up to Lincoln Park. Yes, the whole north side is in ashes. Though the United States has suffered other disastrous fires, including an 1,835 blaze in New York City, which destroyed some 500 buildings. The Chicago fire is the worst fire tragedy in the recorded history of North America. The damage was not limited to the city of Chicago. Sparks lit forest fires that destroyed more than 1 million acres of Michigan and Wisconsin timberland. Burning from October 8 to October 14. These fires were responsible for the loss of more than 1,000 lives in the logging town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and in 16 surrounding communities. Like the Great Fire of London 200 years earlier, a flurry of construction activity followed in the city, making Chicago one of the United States' most architecturally impressive urban centers. In fact, the fire was the impetus for the development of the Chicago School of Architecture, also called the commercial style, since most of it was devoted to office buildings, warehouses, and department stores. The Chicago School was instrumental in establishing the modern movement of architecture in the United States.
What are Islam's 5 pillars of faith?
Muslims practice adherence to the 5 pillars of faith. 1. Belief in Allah as the only God and Muhammad as his prophet. 2. Prayer 5 times daily at dawn, at noon, in the afternoon, in the evening, and at nightfall. 3. Giving alms to the poor. 4. Fasting from dawn until dusk during the holy month of Ramadan. And 5. Making the pilgrimage, Hajj, to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime.
Are the Bushes the first father-son presidents?
No, the nation's 41st, George H. W. Bush, and 43rd, George W. Bush, presidents were preceded as father-son presidents by John Adams, 1735 to 1826, the second President of the United States, and John Quincy Adams, 1767 to 1848, the sixth. There have been other presidents whose relatives held the office before them. Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president, was the grandson of the nation's 9th, William Henry Harrison. Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, and James Madison, the 4th, were second cousins. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was preceded in the office by his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. Genealogists determined that FDR had ties to 10 other presidents as well. 4 of them were blood relatives and 6 were relatives by marriage: John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, James Madison, William Howard Taft, Zachary Taylor, Martin Van Buren, and George Washington.
What is the zero population growth movement?
Abbreviated ZPG, it's an international movement for population control. It had its beginnings in an organization formed in 1968 called Zero Population Growth, which was established with the help of American biologist Paul Ehrlich, 1932. In his book The Population Bomb, 1968, Ehrlich argues that the world's population is growing at a pace that will outstrip its supply of natural resources, reaching the conclusion that overpopulation will inevitably cause widespread starvation and death. While his critics charge that this is an oversimplification of the situation, Ehrlich and others who subscribe to his views argue that overpopulation may not be the only factor leading to a severe shortage of natural resources around the globe, but it surely is the most important. The movement urges parents to have no more than 2 children, at this rate. Called a replacement rate, there would be no population growth. In the late 1990s, researchers reported that in the United States and in much of Europe, the birth rate is below replacement level, while in some of the world's poorer countries, the average birth rate can be as high as 8 children per woman.
How long has the waltz been danced?
Considered the quintessential ballroom dance, the waltz first became popular in Europe in 1813. But it dates as far back as the mid-1700s, the first written occurrence of the word waltz was in 1781. In the 1850s the dance captivated Vienna, and the prolific Johann Strauss, 1825 to 1899. Also known as the Waltz King, produced scores of new waltzes to meet the increasing demand. Many of the compositions were named for professional associations and societies. One of the most well-known waltzes is the Blue Danube, first performed by Strauss on February 15, 1867, in Vienna. The lyrics, from a poem by Carl Beck, were sung by the Viennese Male Singing Society. The new waltz created an immediate sensation. It is an Austrian tradition whenever the Blue Danube is played that the opening strain is played first, followed by a pause before the work is played by the full orchestra. The pause is so that the audience may applaud.
When was the first fax machine developed?
The fax, facsimile, machine may seem like a recent invention, but it was developed long ago. It took more than 100 years for the machines to become part of everyday life. In 1842 to 1843, Scottish philosopher and psychologist Alexander Bain, 1818 to 1903, invented the first, albeit crude, fax machine. The scanning technology was improved enough by 1924 that newspapers began using the device to transmit photographs. By the 1930s, wire photos were an important component of newspaper reports. It was not until the 1980s that faxes came into widespread use. As manufacturers produced the more compact and affordable machines that are visible in most every place of business today.
What was the importance of Hitler's beer hall putsch trial?
The 1924 trial of German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945, and 9 other men, charged with treason for their attempted coup, in German, Putsch, of late 1923, marked the beginning of Hitler's seemingly unstoppable rise to power. As the leader of the Nazi Party, National Socialist's German Workers' Party, Hitler had gained enough of a following to believe that on the night of November 8, 1923, as Bavarian leader Gustav von Kahr spoke in a Munich beer hall, Hitler and his followers, all of them determined to recreate a powerful German Empire and rid it of its mongrel-like quality, could topple the weak German government. Merely by demonstrating that the Nazis, and not the official government, had gained the support of the people. But in a march through Munich the following day, the still loyal Germany Regular Army and the Bavarian State Police opened fire on the Nazi demonstrators and their sympathizers, killing 16 and arresting Hitler and his 9 co-conspirators. Their trial began on February 26, 1924, over the course of 25 days. Aided by radio and newspaper coverage, Hitler held forth, in one case taking 4 hours to respond to a single question, earning him the overwhelming support of the German people. His impassioned appeals turned what ought to have been an open and closed case of treason against him into an indictment of the German government. His basic argument was this: I cannot declare myself guilty. True, I confess to the deed, but I do not confess to the crime of high treason. There can be no question in an action which aims to undo the betrayal of this country. In 1918, Hitler was referring to the German surrender in World War I, 1914-18. Nevertheless, he and 9 others were convicted of treason. Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, where he wrote the first volume of his infamous work Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which revealed his frightening theories of racial supremacy and his belief in the Third Reich. Released after only 9 months, Hitler walked out of prison more popular than he had been before his highly publicized trial.
Citizens were encouraged to build bomb shelters. School children participated in air raid drills. Civil defense films, such as How Can I Stay Alive in an Atom Bomb Blast?
Were screened, and entire towns conducted tests of how residents would respond in the event of an A-bomb. Meantime, the leak of top-secret information from the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, New Mexico, was traced to New York City machine shop owner Julius Rosenberg, his wife, and her brother, David Greenglass. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin writes that the short, plump Mrs. Rosenberg looked more like one of my friend's mothers than an international spy. Indeed, the case marked the first time American civilians were charged with espionage. And the trial made international headlines. Though the Rosenbergs were only two of many involved in the conspiracy, theirs was the heaviest of the punishments handed down in the cases against the spy ring. For their betrayal and their refusal to talk, the Rosenbergs were sentenced to death. In issuing the sentence, Judge Irving Kaufman accused the couple of having altered the course of history. The penalty rocked the world, as Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter put it. They were tried for conspiracy and sentenced for treason. They were electrocuted the evening of June 19, 1953, as New York's Union Square filled with an estimated 10,000 protesters.